Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today's guest, Shail Khiyara, is the CEO of Swarm Engineering. Now, Shail's somebody that I really enjoy talking with about artificial intelligence. That's one of my favorite topics, as many of you know, and this gentleman is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to that topic. Shail is an author, a best-selling author at that. He has multiple books that he released, including Agentic Artificial Intelligence. Now, Shail started his career in engineering and has some phenomenal stories about what he did in the industrial space all around the globe. But then he made the switch into working in agriculture. Now, I think to sum up Shail's career, it would be to say he's got a really rich depth of knowledge and experience in not only engineering, but artificial intelligence and technology, where it's actually applied in useful cases in industry around the world. Shail is also a board advisor and board member to several different AI companies in this applied industrial space. Now, Shail's work around artificial intelligence really focuses in on the operator, the human side, dealing with artificial intelligence. And I really appreciate that about his perspective. And that's what we're going to really dig into today on this episode. So I'm really excited for you to dig out some real nuggets of wisdom from this conversation that I had with Shail. But before we do that, I just want to give you a quick heads up on something that I've been working on recently. Now, I have heard from a lot of farmers and a lot of the audience that have been reaching out to me for help turning AI from something that's an interesting idea or abstract idea into something that's practical that they can use on a daily basis in their own operations. So I wanted to say, I've heard you and I'm going to do something about it. I'm not ready to share the details quite yet, but I'll have an exciting announcement coming very soon on the next couple of podcasts. So stay tuned for that. And I think this episode with Shail really fits what that is going to be targeting. So this is a great interview to listen to kind of prep for that. So with that, here's my conversation with Shail Khiyara. All right, today on the AgCulture Podcast, we're talking about one of my favorite subjects, artificial intelligence and data. But we're also going to dive into an aspect that we really haven't hit on much before on the podcast with an expert from the industry. Shail Khiyara is here today on the episode. He is the CEO of Swarm Engineering. Welcome to the show, Shail.
Excited to be here, Paul. I've heard a lot of things about the AgCulture Podcast. You're doing some wonderful recordings. I've heard them. And super excited to be here.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that. We first connected at the World AgriTech Summit back in, I believe that was in March, and had a few different conversations and really appreciated some of the perspectives that you brought out on artificial intelligence and how it's getting adopted in different industries, especially in agriculture. So I want to give the audience some context. You first started out really in industrial operations and then moved over to the world of agriculture. And now you're in this role, CEO of Swarm Engineering. So let's give the audience a little bit of background on your industrial experience and then why you switched over to the world of agriculture.
Sure, happy to, Paul. Look, I spent the early part of my career on the ground in industrial operations. So we're talking a gas oil separation unit plants in Saudi Arabia's empty quarter, build, operate, transfer projects in post-war Croatia, mining projects in Chile and Brazil, and essentially, environments where a decision made slowly or made without the right context wasn't an inconvenience. It was a real cost, sometimes a safety issue as well. And what I noticed in several of these places that I work is that people running those operations carried an enormous amount of judgment that never showed up in any manual, right? They knew things because they had seen things, not because someone had written it down. It was experiential. And since then, having spent the last 12 years writing about and building AI and automation businesses, I have come to realize that there is the same pattern in agriculture and food production, right? A grain co-op or a fresh produce operator or even an aquaculture business for that matter, any of these industries. And the tools that they had were either generic dashboards that couldn't decide anything, primarily a spreadsheet and a person's gut, right? So we built Swarm to close that decision gap. It's the time between when the information to make a good call is available and when somebody actually makes that call. So we pair an optimization engine that can actually solve the hard allocation, planning problems with a conversational layer that lets the operator ask questions in plain language and natural language, not just English, any language, and get an answer on that immediately. The thesis underneath all of it is simple, right? I'm a big believer that silicon needs carbon, silicon being AI and carbon being us, human forms. The technology only works if it's built around the operator, the person who's actually running the operation, not replacing them.
And I like that definition. Let's dig into that a little bit further, the operator in your perspective. A lot of people think, well, the operator might be the business owner, but that's not necessarily true, is it?
It's not necessarily true, but it can be. There are instances where, business owners are rolling up their sleeves and driving the operation. But when I say operator, I mean the person actually making the call. Think about the plant supervisor deciding how to allocate today's harvest. The person balancing the feed and stocking density on a farm, as an example. The planner who decides which truck goes where before the window closes. Management can sometimes imply hierarchy, ownership, title. Operator is about the proximity to the decision, right? That's who I'm referring to in our title of this discussion, because that's who carries the weight when things go wrong and often, does not get any credit when things go right. And what they're up against is real. Take fresh produce operation, allocation decisions have to happen within hours because fruit is fungible and has, a shelf life. Sometimes these decisions have to happen within minutes because the product is degrading the whole time you're spending deciding. And the data that they need to make that call, the demand, the inventory, the transportation, quality usually lives in 4 or 5 different systems. And I'm being very optimistic about 4 to 5 systems. Sometimes it's more than 4 to 5 systems. So the operator ends up doing the integration in their head under time pressure, right? With margins thin enough that one wrong call or, like truck loading, let's say half a full truck, a missed shipping window shows up directly on the bottom line. And that's a significant challenge. It's not a technology problem that people talk about enough. It's a decision latency or a decision gap problem, the gap between, when a decision needs to be made and when the information to make it actually arrives.
Yep. So that's really what the operators are up against right now. And they're dealing with that along with thin margins in a commodity business. They're dealing along with weather and all of these other variables, right? So how does that play into this with all these other variables alongside of that?
I think everyone's worried about replacing the operator, but the bigger risk was already sitting there before AI showed up. We never captured what these people know. So 20, 25, 30 years of pattern recognition living entirely in one person's head, nothing written down, nothing transferable. And that was a vulnerability with or without AI. And what AI does, done right, is it finally gives us a way to capture the scale and judgment instead of losing it the day someone retires. Now, how do operators make this judgment call? I think that's a very interesting question to probe, right? They're rarely just applying a particular rule. They're looking at what is happening right now, comparing it with what they have seen before. So pattern recognition, weighing the competing constraints. So actually awareness of what this constraint or that constraint might do based on the decision that they make. So there's memory aspect to it. And they're weighing these competing constraints of capacity, inventory, labor, cost, quality, service levels, risk. And they're also asking, how reliable is this data, right? What makes this situation different from patterns that I may have seen before? What can I compromise on? What is non-negotiable? So there are some business variables and constraints based on the objectives they are familiar with that they're weighing these decisions off of. Much of that reasoning comes from experience and institutional knowledge that's never formally documented. So judgment call is really the ability to decide which rule, which constraint, which business objective matters the most when they conflict. And that's what vertical specific AI needs to capture, not simply what the business knows, but how some of the best operators make decisions when the answer isn't obvious. And we don't have to, with AI, wait for that 20, 25, 30 years of experience to be built up. We can actually learn from the experience and augment the operator with AI.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, especially when you hear all these stories around agriculture that the average farmer is 67 years old, and what are we going to do when all these people leave the industry with this knowledge bank that has been built up over multiple generations? And I think this is a great opportunity. But does that mean that's going to replace that human judgment in the future?
It changes the job, I think. It doesn't remove the person. What we're removing is the grunt work of pulling the data from multiple systems, running the allocation math by hand every single day. We're not removing the judgment, and the judgment is exactly what the operator brings that the machine doesn't have. The difference is they're deciding with a full picture in front of them in seconds instead of hours. And that changes what a day in the job actually looks like for the operator.
And I think that's a great example. And I know personally on my farm, when I've been training somebody new that has not been in the industry, they pick it up so much quicker when you can show them all of the data points that are going into making a decision on whether to treat this cow or not, or whether to make a feed adjustment or not. And they learn so much faster because they're getting all of this data and judgment calls thrown at them in a very short window that might have taken somebody historically, 10 or 15 years to see that play out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you noticed that in any other specific instances that you've worked in with Swarm? Any specific examples that you can think of?
Well, there are several I can think of where, AI supported a decision without taking away from the operator. I'll give you two real examples. In fresh produce, we're working with a leading Peruvian agro-industrial exporter, right? And at harvest, the fruit quality, the packaging, the market prices are all shifting at the same time. And a manual allocation plan, I just can't keep up with that. It gets locked in and then the reality moves past it. So what the system does is re-optimize the allocation in real time, matching the right fruit to the right market at the right margin as a conditional change instead of this team scrambling to rebuild the plan from scratch. And that happens in between shifts at times, right? And this particular example, within a short period of time, less than a year, that has returned around $1.4 million in incremental profit. And that's not hypothetical. That's a measured return. In aquaculture, we're working with a global seafood producer sourcing tilapia out of various different parts of the world. And every day, someone has to decide which supply goes to which customer in which product form while managing the shelf life and the margin at the same time. Do it wrong, and you either let the inventory expire on the shelf or you ship your freshest produce to a lower margin order. And the system runs a two-phase optimization. It depletes the old inventory and, essentially so nothing goes to waste, and then maximizing the volume and the profitability. So everything that's left is appropriately provisioned to the right customer. And the operator doesn't get replaced in either of these cases, right? They're still the ones who own the relationship, the contract, the judgment call when something doesn't fit the model. So what changes is that they're working from a plan that's actually current instead of the one that is already out of date the moment the conditions shifted.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to all of these different variables that we're dealing with in agriculture, those shifts happen quite rapidly. And this just gives us a better response time to be able to make that right call for the future.
Oh, I'm curious, as you say, those shifts happen. I agree with you. They happen quite often as high volatility. Do you feel there's recognition that within that high volatility, on a drip by drip basis, there is margin loss that is occurring? in a
100%.
low margin business that ag generally operates in, is margin loss well understood, do you feel?
I don't know if it's, I think everyone knows that it's there.
Yes.
I mean, you look
Yeah.
in my world, the dairy world, it's always about feed loss, right? Feed inventory loss, because that's usually 50% of the expenses on a dairy farm. So I was just thinking through in my head, the example that I was going through my head was putting up haylage, right? So you're up against the weather forecast just changed in the last 20 minutes. Now it looks like we got a good chance of getting rain. Do we stop the mower and tell them not to mow anymore? Well, if we do that and it rains the next 2 days, now the quality of what's standing is going to go down. But if we get caught with rain, then the quality of what's already down is going to go down. So you're shifting and making that decision with weather information that you think is accurate, but you don't know exactly how accurate. And you're making a decision of, do I take this quality loss if this happens, or do we take this quality loss if this happens? And which one's better, which one's worse? So that was kind of the example that I was thinking through my head, and being able to really calculate that. I don't think as an industry we're there. Like, you just, as a farmer, you're like, well, let's just keep the mower going. We'll take the risk of it getting rained on. Like, you just make that instinct judgment, but you don't really know, like, well, there's a 60% chance of quality loss in that scenario and a 30% chance over here. So you don't really quantify it, right?
Yeah. And often that information is not available, or if it is, the derivatives of that information, right, become extremely complex for someone to make a quick snap decision at that point in time of which direction to move in. And that's where AI can actually help.
Right. I think there's a huge abundance of examples like that in the farming world, that it can, as you said, augment the judgment, not necessarily completely replace it, but definitely give you a lot more accurate, quantifiable measurement to make a decision with. All right, Shail, so let's pivot a little bit now and talk about the gaps between the horizontal AI tools and the vertical AI tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think most of people using AI have actually touched horizontal foundational model generative AI tools, right? And they're useful. They're useful for many things. They're useful for writing emails, summarizing documents, creating code, et cetera, right? But it's not built to understand the difference between a grain co-op's constraints and a produce operator's constraints, for example. So when operators hear AI, they picture something that doesn't map their world. And understandably, they don't necessarily trust it with a real decision. Hence, vertical AI solutions are critically important. They're different, and their economics are different as well. So first off, vertical AI solutions, which is what Swarm is, they're ontology based. So they understand the inner workings, the variables, the constraints, the objectives of your specific business. It's a system built specifically for the industry. It doesn't need months of training like a foundational model would to become useful. It becomes useful from day one, which means payback shows up fast. For us, that's 10 weeks time to value at Swarm. And, it can provide you a significant efficiency right off the bat, not in some abstract efficiency promise in 18 months, which generally tends to happen with generative AI or horizontal solutions. Second, the economics are different. So from an economic perspective, you're not dealing with token fatigue with SOTA models or state-of-the-art SOTA models, which is the vertical specific AI. So your costs are capped, monthly subscription in our case. Third, it does not require heavy infrastructure to run these because they're not foundational models capturing every possible next word combination from millions of users using it at the same time. They're efficient and they can scale responsibly and efficiently depending on the size of your organization. And lastly, the economics are such that we don't price it on a per user basis. It's priced on a subscription per use case with unlimited users on that particular use case. So I would say in short, horizontal AI must learn your business before it can create value, often with hallucination risk and hidden costs such as token bloat. Vertical AI arrives with the domain already encoded, right? Shortening the time to value, producing 5 to 10x ROI in the right use cases. So the difference between learning the business and already understanding it is the adoption gap. And the adoption gap is not intelligence, it's context. And that's what vertical specific AI brings to the table.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I've been talking a lot about that in many of the talks that I've been giving at conferences, is how important that context is. And without that, like you said, it's very hard to get value from AI, especially a large language model, as you were describing. So one thing I want to ask you a little bit more in depth, how do you, as an operator, identify the right use cases to target?
That's a very good question. I would say identify the business problem first rather than jumping into the technology, and then identify where is the data around that business problem that you're trying to solve. We do these 90-minute what's possible workshops with our prospects. And there it's not a selling exercise, really just bringing data science to the table from our end, and prospect brings their IT person, their data science if they have one, or just the business owner, whether it's the grain operator or the fresh produce expert, or whether it's related to someone who is heading up their supply chain or logistics. In these conversations, what we really find out are that the possibility of having a conversation inside the organization to understand what is the process flow, which business decisions are very critical in nature that impact margin, top line revenue, customer experience for that matter. And we map that against where is the data sitting today. And it's never clean, Paul, by the way. The data always comes in various different shapes and formats to us. And we normalize, rationalize that data. And that's part of the work that we do. So we tend to identify what are the high impact areas within an organization where the data is readily available. And oftentimes we do find that data is not very clean, but the decision impact is pretty significant. Or we find that data is very, very clean, but it doesn't really impact the margin as much. And through that conversation, we're able to identify which use cases to prioritize and how to map them against a deliverable flow that we come up with from that conversation.
So, Shail, one thing I wanted to talk about, and I've guilty of this as an operator of my own farm, is something that I call decision fatigue. So as an operator, we've got all of these decisions to make in a day. Countless decisions that we make in a day, and they all impact our operation. So that decision fatigue is a real thing. So how do you see AI helping that out? And do you see the role of the operator changing and having less of this decision fatigue in the future?
I'm glad you brought that up, Paul, because we live in a very fast-paced world, right? And without AI systems, operators are spending much of their day gathering data, reconciling spreadsheets, chasing missing information, repeatedly making routine decisions. And each individual choice may seem small, but collectively they consume enormous cognitive capacity. And there's a lot of context switching that is happening at the farm level, the operator level as well. And that creates decision fatigue. And as the day progresses, the operators, naturally prioritize what is urgent and what is visible. So more complex decisions, those requiring, for example, scenario analysis or trade-offs or, coordination across teams, can often get postponed because they demand more time and mental energy. And then the consequences is that important decisions do not necessarily get made poorly. Many simply don't get made at all. And so the opportunities to improve margin, to prevent risk, to optimize resources really remains on the back burner while the organization continues to respond to those things that are absolutely immediate. And AI changes this by handling the repetitive analysis, by continuously evaluating options, even though the operator may not be engaging on that particular operation, and surfacing the few decisions that actually require human judgment. So AI as an augmentation tool expands the organization's effective decision-making, allowing the operators to spend, less time assembling information and more time making consequential choices.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's going to have much better outcomes for those operators that are able to make that switch for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, hence we call this episode the operator's decade, because the operator is not going away. The operator now has an augmented capability with AI to be able to have these decisions being surfaced up or triggers surfaced up to say, hey, I think something's wrong here. I think the weather is going to change in this fashion, and the commodity price index just went in this direction. Maybe you may want to take a look at this.
Yep. Now, looking in the future, I'm always curious to see other people's vision of what that looks like. So in 5 years from now, what will an excellent operator be able to do that an excellent operator doesn't really have the opportunity to do today?
That's interesting. I would say that 5 years from now, first of all, you would have a larger pool of excellent operators because you wouldn't have to wait 10 and 15, 20 years to build up the patterns or get trained to recognize how systems operate and what decisions you can make, right? AI as an augmented tool with you next to you can actually help you become an excellent operator. So I think that's one thing that we would see. I'm encouraged by two things. One, I would say, is that we would see a directional shift in margins in this business commensurate to the risk that the business actually takes. And by business, I'm talking about the ag industry as a whole. I think there's tremendous opportunity to use AI as an augmentation tool to improve margins within the business. The other thing I'm encouraged by is that we would see a larger influx of people getting more and more excited in ag, considering that there is a embracement and adoption of AI in ag that is now translating into exciting, interesting, inspirational jobs in the industry. That would be an exciting thing to see in the next 5 years.
Shail, as we end this discussion, what are two things you want an operator listening to this to walk away with?
I would say first that AI in this industry is not about replacing you. It's about making sure that what you know doesn't disappear. That's not a threat. I would say that's a protection for you and the operation itself, and gives you multitude of opportunities to use AI that is scalable, repeatable, and delivers tangible value. So I would say embrace AI. It's not about replacing you. The second is you don't need perfect data to get to a start. You need to name one decision, one business problem that's costing you the most right now, when it's slow or wrong decisions are being made, and start there. Everything else follows from that.
Those are great pieces of wisdom. Shail, where can people find out more about what you're doing at Swarm?
You can go to our website, swarm.engineering, or you can reach out to me, Shail, Shail, at swarm.engineering. And you can also find us on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I enjoyed the other conversations we had before the episode too, and I'm glad we were able to roll some of this wisdom out for the audience. So thank you for being here today.
Great to connect with you, Paul. Thanks for having me here.
Well, that wraps it up for today. I hope you enjoyed this interview that I did with Shail from Swarm Engineering. I thought it was a fascinating interview and really enjoyed his perspective on where artificial intelligence can really have a great impactful fit on operations in agriculture. So with that, I wanted to just give you a quick reminder to check out our friends of the show on our website and newsletter. Thank you to those organizations that help support our podcast. And again, be listening to the next couple of episodes as I release a little more information on some of the exciting announcements and things that I've been working on. Really looking forward to sharing those with you in the very near future. So with that, thanks for listening, and we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast.